Thanks to all of you for coming. Obviously, the topic of voting with your feet and migration rights and related issues are hot both in the United States and here in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. And this book is devoted to those topics. The revised edition of it came out in 2022, a couple years ago. However, I think virtually everything I say there remains as relevant as ever. So in the book, I talk about how voting with your feet can be a better mechanism of political choice in many ways than voting at the ballot box. And also I go into greater detail about three particular types of voting with your feet. Voting with your feet in the federal system, like we have in the United States, and to a certain degree you have in the United Kingdom as well. Voting with your feet in the private sector, where private sector organizations provide services traditionally associated with regional or local governments, and the most controversial, but also potentially the most beneficial type of foot voting, which is foot voting through international migration. But first things first, I want to ask, well, why do we even have to consider foot voting as a mechanism of political choice? After all, most of us probably assume that the way we choose the government policies that we want to live under is at the ballot box. So you in Britain just had a general election where the Labour Party prevailed over various opponents. We in the United States have an election coming up where we have the wonderfully enticing choices of Trump and Biden. And normally we assume that that is the way that we make choices about the kinds of government policies that we live under. So why should we even consider foot voting as an additional possible mechanism of political decision making? And I think voting at the ballot box has important advantages, but it also has two major shortcomings. One is that when you vote at the ballot box, in most cases, the chance that your vote will make a difference is infinitesimally small. In an American presidential election, it's only about 1 in 60 million. Though it can be somewhat higher if you live in a swing state, maybe as high as 1 in 1 million. In a British election, your odds are somewhat higher than American presidential elections, vary somewhat by constituency, but still the bottom line is that the chance of you are making a decisive difference to electoral outcome as an individual voter is something like 1 in several million, which is still very low. In most cases, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom of choice if you're making a decision as only a 1 in 60 million or even a 1 in 1 million chance of making a difference. We wouldn't say that you have meaningful religious freedom if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what faith you want to practice or whether you want to practice one at all. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what opinions you're allowed to express, and so forth. And I would say the same thing is true of political choice as well. For it to be meaningful, you should have an opportunity to make a decisive choice that actually has at least a high likelihood of making a difference in terms of changing the government policies that you live under. Closely related to the issue of the low probability of making a decisive choice is the issue of voter ignorance. If your only reason for becoming informed about politics is to be a better voter, say in a British general election or an American presidential election or almost any election, that turns out not to be much of an incentive at all. You're very unlikely to spend a lot of time learning about the issues and the candidates in a situation where no matter how well informed you are, the chance that your knowledge will make a difference to anything is extraordinarily low. And in fact, in the US, Britain, and other countries for which we have data, it overwhelmingly shows that most voters are what economists call rationally ignorant. Therefore, that is, they devote relatively little time and effort to learning about political issues or about the candidates that they vote on because they have better things to do with their time, and there's extremely little payoff to learning about these issues. There's a lot of data on this. I go through some of it in chapter 1 of this book. I go through it more extensively in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance. Yes, I have to do some advertising for my other books as well. And the bottom line is the voters generally know very little. For example, only about a third of Americans can even name the three branches of the federal government. the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. In the United States, in Britain, and other countries, data repeatedly show that most voters have little or no idea of how the central government spends its money. They tend to vastly underestimate the expenditures on what in the United States we call entitlement programs, primarily for the elderly, and overestimate what is spent on foreign aid. And there are many, many other examples of this kind of voter ignorance. The American Medical Association says before you can be treated by a doctor for anything, the doctor has to get your informed consent. And I would suggest that informed consent is desirable when it comes to government policy as well. After all, as we saw most dramatically during the COVID pandemic, but it's true even in normal times as well, government policy is often literally a matter of life and death for people. It has a huge impact. So ideally, we should have informed consent there too. But in reality, given the problem of voter ignorance, government policy under democracy most of the time is like having a doctor where the patients generally have little idea of what treatments they're giving you, whether those treatments are likely to be effective, or whether they're actually snake oil, and also it's a doctor whose administrations, generally speaking, you're not allowed to refuse. So overall, therefore, there are these two significant problems and shortcomings with ballot box voting. One is that there's only a very low probability that your vote will actually make a difference, and the other close related is the problem of ignorance. On both of these fronts, voting with your feet is greatly superior. If you're allowed to move around freely, say from one state to another United States, or from one country to another, or to make choices in the private sector, that in most cases is a decisive choice that really will make a difference. And for that very reason, both economic theory and lots of empirical evidence show that when people vote with their feet, they seek out more information, they do a better job of evaluating it, and they make a better informed choice. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time seeking out relevant information the last time you decided what television set to buy or what smartphone to get than the last time you decided who to vote for in a general election in the United Kingdom, or really any election for any office. That's not because your television set or your smartphone deals with more important or more complicated issues than the government of your country. It's because when you pick a smartphone, you know that that's the one that will actually end up in your pocket, and you will get to use it. But if you open it up and you have the bad luck to see the President of the United States or some other important government official, you know that there is very little chance that you will be able to influence what they do or what policies they adopt and so on. And so you quite rationally, or at least if you're like most people, you quite rationally devote little time and effort to seeking out information about who to vote for in the election, whereas you devote a lot more time to the foot voting decision of deciding which smartphone to get, which television set to get, and so on. And voting with your feet of different kinds has the same informational properties as choosing a smartphone or a television set and the like. It's a choice where people have strong incentives to acquire information and use it well. I'd like to now take a closer look at the different types of foot voting, beginning with what I think is the most familiar type, which is foot voting in a federal system, where if there is a federal system with multiple jurisdictions, then you can decide which one you want to live under, at least in part based on variation in government policies. And for example, in the United States, we have 50 states and thousands of local governments. That offers a pretty wide range of choice with different jurisdictions, with different patches of government policies. It's a wider range of options, certainly, than you have in our two-party system in ballot box voting, where, with rare exceptions, it's only the Democrats and Republicans. In Britain, I recognize it's a more centralized system. Nonetheless, there is some autonomy for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and some power of local governments, and there are steps that Britain could take to have more of a federal system. Indeed, years ago, I wrote an introduction to Philip Booth's book, Federal Britain, which was published by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which outlines how that could potentially be done. So a federal system potentially offers a wide range of freedom of choice, and in fact, throughout American history and that of a number of other federal systems, this kind of choice has been especially valuable to the poor, the disadvantaged. A dramatic example is that of African Americans who were persecuted in the segregation-era southern states. Millions of them were able to vote with their feet for other states and improve their situation. There are other examples I could give both from the US and from other countries. In recent years, there have been some important obstacles to foot voting within federal systems, both in the United States and in this country and in other places in Europe. And that is the growth of barriers to movement, of which the biggest is restrictive zoning regulations that make it difficult to build new housing in response to demand. And if you can't build a new housing, it's very difficult for people to move there unless they're willing to be homeless or live outside or whatnot. And there are some other barriers as well. In the book, I propose ways to address this problem, the simplest of which is simply repealing many of these regulations, as possibly the new British government, to some extent at least, is planning to do. They've made some announcements about that recently. There are obviously other moving costs that exist in addition to seeking out the cost of housing. Those costs cannot be completely gotten rid of, but I note in the book some ways to mitigate them. The most obvious is decentralizing power to lower levels of government, so you don't have to move as far away to get a different government policy, and therefore the moving costs are lower. There are some other ways we can reduce moving costs as well. So I think in the book I cover a number of other possible objections and reservations to foot voting under federalism. I'm happy to talk about them in questions, but for now, I'd like to move on to the less familiar idea of foot voting in the private sector. We don't normally think of it this way, but there are a lot of private sector organizations that offer goods and services that are similar to those offered traditionally by regional and local governments, and they also offer opportunities for people to vote with their feet. The most significant of them is private planned communities, like condominiums, for example. In the United States, over 70 million people live in private planned communities. This form of organization also exists in the UK and Canada and European countries and even developing nations, and they offer a variety of goods and services similar to those offered by local governments, such as security, parks and recreation, sometimes even educational services, and others. And this offers significant advantages even if compared with foot voting under federalism. One obvious one is that in a given area, you can have many more of these private planned communities than you can have local governments, so there's greater freedom of choice with lower moving costs. Also, studies show that the services offered by these organizations often are better in quality and price than similar ones offered by local governments, so that's an important advantage as well. However, there are objections, of which the most obvious and most commonly made is that really this is only for the wealthy, or as Robert B. Reich, Bill Clinton's former Secretary of Labor, said, it's the secession of the successful. It's the wealthy people walling themselves off from the rest of society. Even in the status quo, this is not really true unless you think there are 70 million very wealthy people in the United States, which at least by US standards there are not. However, it is true that the middle class and the wealthy have somewhat better access to this opportunity than the poor do. In the book, I propose various reforms to mitigate that problem and make this more accessible to more people. It is not my contention that all policy decisions can be subjected to foot voting either in the private sector or in federal systems. However, a lot can, even though there may be some things where the problem is so large scale that it can only be handled by the central government, or in extreme cases only by some kind of international agreement, as with global climate change. However, many policies can, and in many cases it should be decentralized either to lower levels of government or to the private sector. If you think that Denmark or New Zealand or Switzerland is a viable nation and can have its own education policies or healthcare policies and so forth, then American states, many of which have populations comparable or greater in size than those countries, can also have their own policies in those areas. And similarly with regions of England, with Scotland relative to the UK, and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity to expand foot voting in these particular mechanisms through federalism and through the private sector. The most controversial form of foot voting, but also the one that's potentially most beneficial, is through international migration. I think the reasons why it's beneficial, and more so even than foot voting within domestic systems, is because the variation in quality of government is so much greater in the international dimension than it is domestically. Think of examples like this, where you have people fleeing communist Cuba or fleeing the horrible war in Syria, or even more recently, Ukrainians fleeing Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion, and also Russians fleeing the increasingly repressive nature of Putin's regime at home. The increase in freedom and happiness and well-being that these people get if they are able to move to a freer, more prosperous society is vastly greater than almost any benefit almost anybody can get through foot voting within a country. Think of whatever you believe is the best governed region of Britain versus whatever you think is the worst. It might well be a significant contrast, but it's nowhere near as great a contrast as that experienced by these people. So if people in this sort of situation are allowed to move around freely, they can massively increase almost every kind of liberty: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from persecution on the basis of race, ethnicity, and gender, and so forth. And in addition, there are enormous economic benefits. Economists estimate that if we had free migration throughout the world GDP would double. That is, the world would be twice as productive as it currently is. The reason for that is that there are so many millions of people trapped under governments which are oppressive or corrupt or have dysfunctional economic systems. And so no matter how smart those people are or how hardworking, they have little or no chance of ever escaping poverty. Whereas if they are able to move to a freer, wealthier society, they can almost immediately be much more productive. Estimates suggest by 2 or 3-fold, and that does not take into account the fact that they can improve their skills over time, which would increase that difference even more. I would add also that about 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's population lives under dictatorships, depending on how you define what counts as a dictatorship. And for those people, foot voting through international migration is the only realistic hope they have of making any kind of political choice at all. They don't even have the 1 in 1 million chance of making a difference at the ballot box that you and I have, because we live in relatively freer democratic societies. Now, despite these enormous advantages of free international migration, there are a range of objections, and in the book I divide them up into 2 categories. One is the idea that governments have a general right to exclude people. And a second is, even if there isn't the general right to exclude, there might be specific justifications for exclusion, such as particular problems that migration might cause, like overburdening the welfare state, or maybe the migrants might be bad voters, or they might increase crime or spread harmful cultural values, and so forth. And in the book, I cover both of these types of objections, both the idea that there's a general right to exclude, and also the idea that there might be specific policy issues. I'd like to start here with the general right to exclude. One form, the most common form that this idea takes, is the argument that for various territories, there's a particular ethnic or racial or cultural group that are the true owners of the land, and they therefore get to exclude everyone else. So up on the screen is a French nationalist poster put up by the very movement which hoped to prevail in the second round of French elections a couple of days ago, but ultimately did not. It says, La France aux Français, France for the French, And similarly, we can say Germany for the Germans, Italy for the Italians, Japan for the Japanese, and so on. This is a widespread view, but it has a number of problems. One obvious one is that if you look at the history of these countries, or almost any country, you will not find a period when only one group lived there and everybody else is somehow an interloper. Indeed, even the currently dominant group, often they took over the land by conquest and the like. This is very obviously true in the United States, where if you take these sort of ideas seriously, maybe the Native Americans would have the right to expel everybody else. But it's true, I'm sorry to say, even here in Britain, think of the Norman conquest. So you might say, well, maybe the true British people are the Anglo-Saxons, and they can expel the descendants of the Normans. But then you remember the Anglo-Saxons also previously conquered the Britons. The legend of King Arthur arises from a British pre-Anglo-Saxon king who resisted the Anglo-Saxon conquest. So if you go down this path, it becomes a big rabbit hole and suggests that most of the people in the world have no right to live where they currently do. But even aside from these historic issues, there is a deeper issue here, which is if you take this idea seriously, it's a justification for racial or ethnic discrimination. Almost everybody today opposes policies like South African apartheid or the racial segregation that for far too long we had in many parts of the United States. And the argument there is this was unjust to restrict people, to restrict their liberty or restrict where they're allowed to live based on their racial or ethnic identity. If this is unjust within countries, I would suggest that it is unjust internationally as well, and for exactly the same reasons, which is that race and ethnicity and ancestry, these are morally relevant characteristics. They are things that we do not control, and that they don't determine how good a person you are or how much freedom you're allowed to have. There is a broader point here, which applies not just to explicitly racial or ethnic migration restrictions, but to other migration restrictions as well. Think of the world of medieval serfdom, where you have the people on the left, the nobles. They could move around freely for the most part and largely live as they want. On the other hand, the people on the right, the serfs, they could only move around if their lord and master let them. And what is it that the serfs did that was so bad that got them into this situation? Their crime was they chose the wrong parents. They chose to be born to serfs rather than the nobles, and therefore they were stuck in this situation. We readily see that this is unjust. I don't even have to spell out why it is. It's pretty obvious. However, our current system of migration restrictions, even when not based on race and ethnicity, for the most part looks like this. If you're the son or daughter of an American citizen or of a British citizen, then you are allowed to move around and work and live freely in those countries. In some countries like the US, that's also true. If you were born on US territory, but not to a US citizen. On the other hand, if you were born to the wrong parents or in the wrong place or both, then you're out of luck, much like the medieval serf. And if the system of medieval serfdom was unjust, because it was based on this arbitrary distinction of ancestry in place of birth, much the same thing can be said for the modern system of migration restrictions, which is also for the most part based on who your parents are or where you were born or some combination of those two things. And in both instances, of course, in many cases, if you're born to the wrong parents or in the wrong place, that means you end up being consigned to a life of poverty and oppression, in some cases even as bad or worse than what the serfs experienced. There are other objections to these kinds of ethnic or racial justifications for restricting migration, and I'm happy to talk about them in questions. But for now, press on to a different version of the argument for a general right to exclude. This one is more popular in the United States, though I see it elsewhere as well. And this is the idea that the rights of national government can be analogized to those of homeowners or members of a club. So as a homeowner, I can exclude strangers from the house, and I don't necessarily have to have a good reason. I can just say, I don't like this person, he has to stay out. Similarly, if I form a private club, I and the other members We don't necessarily have to have a good reason to exclude people. We can just say it's our club and we can exclude for whatever reason we want. So for instance, I'm a baseball fan, so I can say, let's have a club only for baseball fans, not for fans of other sports, or people who just aren't interested in sports at all. And even if I can't show that baseball fans are somehow better than other people, I can still exclude all the non-baseball fans from my baseball club. There are many problems with this kind of analogy, and I go through them in the book. Here I'll mention just one big one. And that is, if you take this sort of idea seriously, it's a license for severe oppression, not just towards immigrants, but also towards natives. Consider that the owner of a house or the members of a club, those people within the spaces they control, they can restrict what speech is allowed or what religion. For example, in my house, I can say only certain political views can be expressed, or only a particular religion can be practiced, the one I like. And similarly, I can form a club that's only for Christians, or only for Muslims, or only for supporters of the Tory party or of the Labour Party, and so on. And if a government's powers are analogous to those of a homeowner or a club, that means you can essentially authorize a totalitarian state that can suppress speech, religion, or almost anything else that it disapproves of. So I think this problem by itself is enough to reject the house and club analogies, but I have a range of other objections to those analogies that I'm happy to talk about in questions. Even if you reject the idea of a general right to exclude, there is still the issue of maybe you can exclude people because there are particular negative side effects of migration. So for instance, maybe migrants would overburden the welfare state, maybe they would increase the crime rate, maybe they have bad values and as a result would vote for bad candidates who support bad policies. I know this is hard to believe, but if you have too many of the wrong kinds of voters, we might even elect a president of the United States who has no regard for liberal democratic values, and if he loses an election, he doesn't accept his defeat, he instead tries to stay in power through force and fraud. It's difficult to believe, but such things could potentially happen if you have the wrong kinds of voters, so it is said we got to restrict migration in order to prevent these sorts of issues. In the book, I go through a wide range of issues of this kind. I don't have time to talk about all of them in the presentation, but I will outline the general framework that I think should be used to think about such things. It consists of asking three questions. First, we should ask, how big is this problem really? In many situations, it will turn out that it's not much of a problem at all. For example, in both the United States and Britain, far from overburdening the welfare state, the vast majority of immigrants are actually net contributors to the public fisc. They put in more money than they take out. Similarly, in the US and Britain, things are more complicated. In the US, far from increasing the crime rate, immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, actually have significantly lower crime rates than native-born American citizens. And there's a range of other problems which are often brought up where the answer is simply either this is not really a problem at all, or at least the problem is much smaller than is often claimed. But what if there is a real problem? I don't deny that sometimes there can be. Then we should ask the second question, which is there a keyhole solution? That's the term that scholars use to refer to a mechanism for mitigating the problems caused by migration without barring people from migrating. We seek to do this by less draconian means, and it turns out that almost always there are various relatively simple keyhole solutions. For example, let's say, contrary to the fact that immigrants were overburdening the welfare state, there is the obvious keyhole solution of simply limiting their access to welfare benefits, which the US already does to some extent under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. Depending on the type of visa, the UK does this as well, but we could potentially do more of it if evidence showed that it was necessary. Similarly, if you believe that immigrants are terrible voters and the like, then you can also do more of what we already do. In the US, for example, immigrants are not allowed to become citizens and vote unless they've been there for at least 5 years, and even then, they have to pass a civics test that most native-born Americans would fail if they had to take it without studying. The UK has a similar test of its own. In principle, we could lengthen that waiting period. We can make the test harder and use other similar measures. And there are similar keyhole solutions for a wide range of other potential issues as well that I talk about in the book, and I'm happy to talk about in questions also. But let's say there is a problem and there doesn't seem to be a keyhole solution that is viable. Still, I would ask a third question, which is what about all the massive wealth that is created by migration? We could potentially tap some of that wealth in order to mitigate negative side effects of migration. For instance, what if it turns out to be the case that immigration really does increase crime? An obvious tapping the wealth approach to that is simply to take some of the wealth created by migration and spend it on putting more police officers on the street. There's a lot of evidence from social scientists that having more police on the streets reduces crime, not because the police shoot the criminals or catch them, but simply because even very stupid criminals, if they see a police officer standing right there, they will probably say, you know what, maybe it's not a good idea for me to commit a crime with the cops standing right there. And so you can divert some money to that. Indeed, in my book, I calculate if the United States were to abolish ICE, the federal government agency tasked with catching and deporting undocumented immigrants, and spent that money on ordinary law enforcement just by that alone, we could put many thousands of additional police officers on the street and actually reduce crime much more than ICE ever does. So there are tapping the wealth solutions like this for many other kinds of issues. Another obvious one is, what if you believe, again, largely contrary to the fact that migration reduces the wages of native workers? You can tap some of the wealth and you can use it for wage subsidies for whatever category of native-born workers you think are unfairly disadvantaged. In the US, we have the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, which already does this for low-wage workers, but you could increase the payments, you could target them to particular regions or industries, and so forth. And there are tapping the wealth approaches for other potential negative side effects of migration as well. I'll end the section on objections with this, that if you take these objections to international migration seriously, almost all of them turn out to be justifications for migration restrictions within countries as well. For instance, if you believe the United States is a club, why can't the state of Virginia be a club where I live? Why shouldn't we be able to exclude people from West Virginia or from other states? If you believe that the ethnic or cultural majority in a nation has the right to exclude people, why not the ethnic or cultural majority in a particular province or state? Why shouldn't Francophone Quebecers be allowed to exclude Anglophone Canadians? Why shouldn't Scots be allowed to exclude the English, and vice versa, and so on? And similarly, if you think that we can restrict people's freedom of movement based on the fact that they might overburden the welfare state and the like, well, again, I live in the state of Virginia. Next door is the state of West Virginia, which is much poorer than we are and has a higher crime rate and the like, so why shouldn't we Virginians be able to keep out the West Virginians for fear that they would overburden our welfare state or increase our crime rates, and so forth. So these arguments, have taken seriously, have drastic implications for internal freedom of movement as well as the international kind. In the last part of the book, I talk about institutional implications for both domestic institutions and international ones. That these institutional approaches can help increase opportunities for people to vote with their feet and at the same time mitigate possible side effects. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll mention just a few. Within countries, it can help to have a decentralized political system with federalism that increases opportunities for foot voting. It also helps to have a constitutional framework that protects a wide range of individual rights, many of which are useful for foot voting. One example that I've written about a lot is property rights to build housing on your land, in addition to being good for other reasons, enabling people to build new housing facilitates foot voting because if an area becomes attractive to people voting with their feet, then developers in that area can build new housing in response to demand. There are other individual rights that facilitate foot voting as well. There are also implications for international law and institutions. One obvious one is for refugee law. Currently, in the United States and Britain and most other countries, and also by international treaty, there is only a relatively narrow category of people who are given the legal status of refugees, which means that the government of the receiving country is not allowed to just expel them. It's people subject to persecution on a specific set of narrow grounds like race, ethnicity, religion, political views, and one or two others. I suggest at the very least expanding this to cover victims of what I call equal opportunity oppression, which is what many dictatorships practice when they oppress almost everyone under their rule, and also victims of war and violence and the like. And there are other ways to expand this as well. Conversely, though, while I think it's desirable to increase protection for refugees, I also argue in the book that we should be wary of expanding global governance systems, or in the extreme case, world government. I recently expanded on this in a piece called The Cosmopolitan Case Against World Government. That was actually just published yesterday. And my concern is that if you have a world government or even global governance that falls short of world government, then you create a government that, at least until we have space colonies, is one that we don't have any opportunity to vote with our feet against. There are also other risks of world government, such as that if it degenerates into authoritarianism, unlike with authoritarianism or other oppressive government in one country, where at least there are alternatives and competition, this kind of authoritarian world government or even totalitarian state would have no rivals and therefore could potentially last much longer and be more difficult to get rid of. In the extreme, you might even get what George Orwell worried about, which is a boot stamping on a human face forever. But I don't want to end just on that negative note. I want to suggest that expanding people's opportunities to vote with their feet, both domestically and internationally, expands political freedom and political choice, and is also highly beneficial to human welfare. Moreover, both domestically and internationally, even if in the short to medium term it cannot be expanded as far as I would advocate, there's plenty of room for incremental reforms and improvements. So thank you so much, and I very much look forward to discussion and questions.